To the second and final day of A Fair Share for Children, the 2020 Laureates and Leaders for Children Summit. Thank you for joining us today. If you missed any portion of yesterday's program, you can find videos on each session on Facebook and YouTube. We're starting today with a thematic panel about the education crisis, moderated by the Secretary General of Education International, Mr. David Edwards. Our panel today includes Deputy Secretary General of the Organising for Economic Cooperation and Development, Mr. Ulrik Knudsen, 1992's Nobel Laureate, Dr. Rigoberta Menchu, Chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association, Dr. Maisha Reza, Organizing Bureau of European Students' Unions, Mr. Edvardas Vabuolas. I turn the floor over to you, Mr. Edwards.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to one and all. I think it's only appropriate that I begin by recognizing and thanking Kailash Satyarthi for his inspiration, his moral leadership in bringing together laureates and leaders at this at all times, but right now at a time of a leadership vacuum at the global stage, at a time of a global pandemic where we need now more than ever global solidarity and action and focus in the face of this pandemic. So, Dhanyavad Kailashji, it's a pleasure to be with you all. My name is David Edwards. I'm the General Secretary of Education International, which is the World Federation of Teachers' Organizations and Unions in 186 countries, 32.5 million members, teachers from early childhood all the way up to higher education. And my members, like the students of the world, are facing this pandemic. It's about 190 countries who have decided to close schools to stop the spread. It's about 1.6 billion students who have been out of school. And let's just put it this way. This was at a moment when we were already trying to get about 260 million children into school. So the conditions by which we're able to do that have just gotten more difficult. And let's be clear. Let's be very, very clear. The pandemic is not affecting everyone equally. There are places, about half the world's population has access to internet and broadband, and the other half does not. There's half the population where there's distance learning and education happening, where parents are home with their students, and there's another part of the world where students do not have parents home with them, supporting them, where many of them are now themselves forced to go out and work. We're looking at potentially 11 million students, more students even being pushed out. That's the point of this panel. The panel has been brought together to take a look at how we ensure we don't lose a generation due to the pandemic. And I am very pleased to introduce 4 fantastic speakers who are going to help us conceptualize and think about the multiple ways in which the pandemic is impacting education, school closures, and the most marginalized. The fact that the world community has not yet stepped up in terms of the money that's been raised and we need to make sure that 20% of the resources raised go to the 20% most marginalized. We're going to get to there in a second. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to briefly make some open remarks from their perspective where they are. We have a leader of a multinational international organization. We have a Nobel laureate leader and one of my very favorite heroes, great book. We have two fantastic student leaders. So let's pass the word first. I'd like to hear from Dr. Maisha Reza, who's the chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association. I'd like to hear from you, Maisha, in terms of your perspective right now and what you think we need to focus on to not lose the generation due to the pandemic. Maisha, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the 100 million for having me on this panel today. It is indeed my honor and privilege to be among such esteemed speakers. Today I speak as the chair of the Commonwealth Students Association and with a mandate from students all across the Commonwealth. Much of what I will be speaking today, I believe world leaders already know. They have the data, they have the statistics, the research reports on their desks about the plight of marginalized children and youth around the world. We've also heard leaders speak on multiple occasions to their citizens, blaming COVID-19 pandemic as this invisible monster that is tearing apart our lives and attributing all the problems from hunger, unemployment, crime and violence, and a string of atrocities to the pandemic. Now, while the pandemic has caused widespread devastation, it has not initiated this global crisis, but rather significantly amplified the already existing gaps and cracks that were left unresolved and overlooked. The education crisis was one that existed long before the pandemic. So before the pandemic in 2018, children around the world were already faced with poor access to quality education. 258 million children and adolescents were out of school in 2018. Moreover, 400 million primary school children lacked basic reading skills. That highlights the substandard quality of education that these children were afforded. At the height of the pandemic, over 1 billion children were locked out of school, and it is now estimated that the potential dropout numbers will range between 6.8 million and 10.9 million. So the argument is not only a moral one, but an economic and financial one, where our world is walking into a $10 trillion loss in future earnings. So fixing this problem is not just the right thing to do. It is the most sensible thing to do. We've heard over and over again that we are running out of funds to continue helping marginalized members in our countries, but we do not seem to find shortage of funds when it comes to bailing out big multinational companies that are disproportionately less affected by this pandemic. In March, the G20 countries announced an initial COVID-19 economic response of $5 trillion. Now, if our leaders just allocated 20% of this initial package to the 20% of the most marginalized children, that $1 trillion among a myriad of benefits would fully fund the UN COVID-19 appeals and save over 70 million lives. So how humanity responds collectively to the crisis today will determine the future that we build for our children and the future of our people and our planet. It is not just COVID-19 that is exacerbating global inequality. The world's unjust economic response to COVID-19 will deepen global inequality for at least a generation. So now listen, the most marginalized and vulnerable have been left to fend for themselves, and millions of children will pay the price with their lives unless we act now. Young people and students are at crossroads between fulfilling their economic potential in the long run through education and between contributing to their family sustenance and their basic survival. This is an extremely unfair choice that they're having to make for the poor decisions of world leaders. What do we ask from them? What we ask from world leaders is that We need you to act now in partnership with students, youth, NGOs, and nonprofit organizations. Young people are no longer just demanding resources and support from governments and leaders. We are ready to work with you as partners to ensure that we do not lose a generation due to the lack of access to education. We are on the ground. We know what is going on. We have the capacity to mobilize children and young people to stay in school and succeed. But we need you to make bold and unconventional commitments, moving away from popular decisions and allocating sufficient resources to the most vulnerable children and families, not just with cash handouts, which are short-term solutions, but couple it with solutions to tackle multiple forms of deprivation, such as improved access to healthcare and free, high-quality public education. We as a generation are looking to you and holding you accountable, for the decisions you make will not just stay in your offices, but impact the everyday survival of those who are on the brink of losing their hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reza. That was very powerful statement and I think very poignant for everyone that's listening and summing up exactly why this is such an important moment. As you were speaking and I was thinking about Rigoberta Menchu, who I'm going to pass the mic to, I'm thinking about Dr. Menchu's book and the time that she herself was a young child who demanded action, who recognized injustice and spoke up and became an activist, who then went on to win the Nobel Prize and make such a difference in so many people's lives. Dr. Rigoberta Menchu, it's an honor to pass the microphone to you.
Igualmente, es un gran honor. Quiero saludar con mucho cariño a mis amigos, a mi amigo y hermano Kailash. Gracias por esta cumbre. En primer lugar, estoy de acuerdo que el presupuesto de la educación pública tiene que ver con la calidad de la educación pública. Y desafortunadamente, casi en todo el planeta, la educación pública tiene un bajo nivel, solamente llega a pocas personas y la inmensa mayoría de las personas son los niños, porque los niños es donde hay mucha deserción escolar en muchos países de América Latina y sé que en otros continentes. Y luego la voluntad política. Realmente las llamadas democracias nunca tuvieron un plan de gobierno que priorizara especialmente la educación, la salud, las condiciones básicas para la población. Esta educación es memorizada y despoja todo tipo de valores y principios ancestrales, especialmente en los países donde es urgente una educación bilingüe intercultural o bilingüe multicultural. También en tiempo de pandemia lo que estamos viendo es la tecnología, pues muchos están recibiendo sus clases en línea, pero la inmensa mayoría de la población pobre no tiene celular, no tiene teléfono, no tiene buena red de señal. Por lo tanto, el título de esta cumbre es pertinente porque estamos perdiendo efectivamente una era para la educación formal y una era para la participación de los jóvenes, los niños y las niñas, especialmente porque siempre continuó en muchos países la marginación de las niñas y la marginación de las personas que tienen diversa expresión cultural. Creo que enfatizar la educación es importante tomar en cuenta la educación ancestral, la educación en la familia, el fortalecimiento de la armonía familiar, porque es lo más sagrado y es lo único que le queda a nuestra población mundial. Yo estoy segura que de este foro, de esta cumbre, se va a unir voluntades y tenemos mucho trabajo, muchos desafíos y muchos retos de futuro, especialmente en la educación, que es la parte más importante para nuestros niños y el éxito la parte más importante del éxito de nuestras nuevas generaciones. Gracias por esta oportunidad, me siento muy feliz. Estoy en un departamento muy pobre de Guatemala, que es el departamento del Quiché.
It is an honor for me as well to be here. I want to greet all of you and my dear friend and brother, Kailash. Thank you for organizing this summit. First of all, I have to say that I agree that the budget for public education has to be devoted to quality education. But we have to say that it is terrible that around the world, public education is of very poor level. And if education exists, it only reaches a smaller part of the population, and the majority of the children have been forced to drop out of school in order to help in some countries they have to drop out of school given the circumstances. And I also have to say that political will in the so-called democracies has failed to have a plan. Governments don't have a plan to protect education, to protect health, to protect basic conditions of living. And but most education is based on rote memory. So the principles of our ancestors are not present in education. And in some countries like mine, it is urgent to have bilingual and intercultural education, bilingual and multilingual education as well. And in these times of pandemics, we have to talk about technology. Many may have access to online classes, but the majority of the poor, they don't have access to a cell phone. They don't have access to a phone. They don't have access to good signal. So I agree with the title of this summit. It is very relevant to talk about the generation, the era that we're losing in formal education, because this is affecting our youth, our children. And in most countries, children are marginalized as well as other portions of the population. So education is paramount, education based on the ancestral knowledge that our families bring along. And I would like to stress the importance of being in harmony with our families, which is one of the most sacred values that we have left in this world. And I am certain that this summit will bring along engagements where I'm sure we're going to join forces and work together to face the challenges that are ahead of us, especially in the area of education. Education is very important because it would bring success for children. And when I talk about success, I think of the generations to come, and that is why I thank you for this opportunity to be here. I am very happy. I am very happy to be here talking about what we can do to help.
Thank you, and we're very happy to have you here. Next, we have Ulrik Knudsen, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD and a native of Denmark, I believe. That's correct. And that's a country that we've been following very closely around the school opening, one of the first that was able to reopen through social dialogue and make sure that people were at the table. You have a long history of that. The OECD obviously plays a very important role in bringing together knowledge sharing, following base erosion, following financing for education, for skills, for lots of things like that. So a very important moment in terms of creation of a multilateral response to COVID. A lot of money has been raised, not very much of it has gone there. We look forward to hearing from you now, Ulrik, please.
Well, thanks a lot. I am based in Paris, but joining you today from Denmark. So hello from Copenhagen to all of you, wherever you are. It's an honor to be part of this critical discussion on the importance of placing children and education at the center of this global response to the pandemic. I've been given 3 minutes, but I can tell you that if you'd only given me 3 seconds, I would just say that I perfectly agree with everything the two previous speakers have said, really. So I think I'll spend my 3 minutes trying to tell you how OECD analysis actually underpins what has been said by the first two speakers. Thankfully, the youngest among us have been largely spared from the direct health effects of the COVID-19 crisis. All trends that we observe suggest that children are far less likely than adults to be infected and develop severe symptoms. But despite this, of course, children are at risk of being among the biggest collateral victims of this pandemic, and that's what we should focus our attention on today. Data already has shown us that the worst effects are concentrated among children who are already vulnerable, including those living in poverty, children with disabilities, refugee children, and more. So the discontinuity of schooling has also reinforced educational inequalities, putting children with low-quality home learning environment at risk of being left. You already touched upon the digital divide, which is also crucial in this regard. We need to address this very, very quickly if we want to avoid a rise in inequality, and not only among the current generation of children, but also the one to come, the next generation of children. OECD evidence shows very clearly that early life disadvantage is very rarely overcome. Experiences and opportunities from childhood shape adult outcomes. So it is extremely important that we get it right from the beginning. In this context, and also in the context of the current crisis, we would also like to highlight that there are unquestionable benefits to keeping schools open. We have to keep schools open. It's not only a matter of learning, it's not only a matter of a simple transfer of knowledge, that's important as well, but it's not least a social experience, and the lack of social context for learning will affect children. And to be honest, this is not only for the children's sake, it's for the sake of all of us. We if you'll just allow me, we announced 2 days ago our annual Education at a Glance report, not a particular focus on children as such, but education overall. And the main message here was that the school closings that we've seen already now due to the corona COVID will, for the rest of this century, dampen GDP by 1.5%. So 1.5%, you could say, of GDP is permanently lost. That shows you how much value there is to keeping schools open. So let me end by saying that in these times of greater pressure on government budgets, it's our collective duty to ensure that education and care for young children and their families is not sacrificed for pressures temporarily deemed more urgent. I think this is a very real danger now with budgets tightening in governments across the world. In the face of a global economic crisis and the tighter budgets I just mentioned, OECD analysis shows that it's more important than ever for governments to prioritize their budgetary spending and to invest in society in ways that will generate positive returns for generations to come. And this really all starts with our children and their education. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to go to Edvardas Vabuolas from OBESSU, the Organizing Bureau of the European School Students Union. And we just heard the economic arguments about why schools should remain open, be made open. I'm going to have a hunch that you're also interested in the rights aspect, but thank you for being with us, Edvardas. Over to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, you will definitely hear a few arguments, economic arguments from my side as well. But thank you again. As been said, my name is Edvardas, and I'm a former board member at European School Student Union, and I currently serve as a 100 million campaign trustee. I thank them for making the summit happen. I thank them for inviting me, and I thank all the speakers before me for the very interesting interventions. OBESSU, the European School Student Union, has been in a close communication with all of our members from the early days of the pandemic. We have done our research, and there are a few insights that might be of your interest. First and foremost, our research has been carried out in March. Back then, our main concern was that not all teachers were sufficiently equipped with skills to carry out online distance learning. What that means in human terms is disparity. Unequal teaching quality leads to unequal opportunities even at the same school. So if you have a professional teacher, brilliant at a subject, but they can't make the microphone work, very likely you will not receive quality education. And this can be also looked from a student socioeconomic perspective. UNESCO reports that 47% of all primary and secondary students do not have access to internet at home. Therefore, for nearly 5 decades, OBESSU has been saying that students should have a seat at the table. Civic space for students in education can help make more informed choices about how and when to reopen schools. or in the case of a second pandemic wave or a localized lockdown, how to shed them. No one knows student needs and student home environment suitability for studying better than the student themselves. Therefore, lack of access to digital learning and lack of civic space in education is one way how to lose a generation to a pandemic. However, an education crisis in Europe is nowhere near in scale to an education crisis in low-income countries. Globally, the World Bank estimates that because of lower levels of learning, lost months of schooling, or potential dropping out of school, approximately $10 trillion can be lost from the world economy. I do say dollars because that is the way economies are measured. What stands behind that monetary value is goods and services, otherwise known as the product. We can get into sophisticated discussions about redistribution of the product, but whilst there is poverty, starvation, lack of social care, and access to medical supplies, I believe it is safe to say that we do not have enough product in the first place. This is why governments are subsidizing private sector, to prevent them from collapsing so they would continue creating us the product, the goods or the services. However, economy has to serve people, not the other way around. Therefore, if we gave all subsidies to private sector and spared none to those in immediate need, we will lose decades of efforts in eradicating poverty, decades of efforts in putting all school children back to school where they belong, and returning to this pre-coronavirus point, which was not ideal in the first place, will be much more costly, as reported by UNICEF and International Labour Organization. We do know that education is a main driver against inequality, a way to foster peace and bring innovations to the world. Ignoring long-term benefits of education is equivalent to exacerbating the crisis. Therefore, donor governments must pay the fair share for every child, a contribution to our world education. Cancel ongoing debts if needed, so that the low-income countries could meet 20% target of domestic financing to be allocated to education. Or else, we will lose this generation and create a financial burden for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the panelists, thank you all for those opening remarks. We've received a question that 30 youth activists from countries from India, Germany, UK, Pakistan, Liberia, Kenya, Cameroon, many countries were met earlier today, came up with one question. And I'd kind of like to pose that one question to all of you, but I might add a sort of a separate follow-up, if I may, and then we will go to take questions from the audience, the participants around the world who are following on the live stream. The question is, across Africa, children and young people are not represented in governments. We heard two of the panelists talk about this. They're not given the chance to participate in decision-making about policies or the allocation of resources. And now they're facing an educational crisis and long-term unemployment due to COVID-19. But the governments have failed them. They've made no plan for the future. So what mechanisms do you think are needed to make sure that there is accountability for this and that the voices of youth are taken into account? And if I could just sort of, in addition to the issue of voice, what message do you have for world leaders at a time when $8 trillion has been raised for COVID and less than 0.13% of it has gone to the most marginalized? What message do you have for them? So the first question is from the students about voice, and my question to you is specifically about how do we actually get people to care and wake up to the great inequality in terms of how resources are being marshaled? What can we do? So let's go back to Dr. Reza. Maisha, could you care to answer?
So thank you so much for this question. I think in terms of voice, I'll address the aspect of voice and making our voices heard first. So this is the kind of platform that we have as student leaders, our student unions, our national student organizations, our youth councils. We have to make full use of these organizations. So youth organizations, NGOs, student leaders are all coming together. For example, we have the Commonwealth Students Association, the All Africa Student Union, and other student unions coming together and backing the 100 million campaign to demand from world leaders that they dedicate 20% of their COVID relief fund to the most marginalized 20% of the global community. Now, one thing that I have to say is I recently spoke on another panel on whether youth voices are important and whether youth voices are matter. And the one thing that I always say is that every young person has a voice and it has to be heard. It is up to us how we bring that voice forward and ensure that that is being taken into consideration. If we cannot raise our voice on an individual platform, we can join groups like student unions and national student organizations to push and lobby for decision makers to listen to us. There are other ways that we can also get decision makers to point out decision makers' flaws. We can use Twitter, social media, it's at our fingertips. We can use very, very simple individual platforms to tag them and call them out and discuss with them on public platforms on what are the wrong choices they're making, or make suggestions and recommendations on what can be done better. And I think putting them on a public platform and putting them on a public light encourages them to respond, encourages them to take action. And I think that whether you talk about politicians or whether you talk about decision makers and leaders, they all want to continue staying in power. And this can only happen when you have the youth vote, when you have the youth voice and the youth vote. So I think we don't take ourselves seriously enough as young people that we have the power to make that change. We have the power to bring decision makers into power. We have the power to get them out of power by voting them out. But we have to take ourselves seriously. And in the other aspect on what else can young people do, I think young people should now take the mantle and bring it forward, because I think that we don't have enough courage, or we are not expressing enough courage. We think that we're young, our voices are not valid because it's being invalidated. A lot of young people are looked at in a very tokenistic fashion, where they're just there to take a box of representation and take a box that, you have enabled diversity and inclusion. But this is unfair, and this is very, very narrow in terms of the thought process. So what we need to do is make sure that we're not treated in a tokenistic manner, and we have to put our collective forces together. And as I said, like we as CSA, we're representing the Commonwealth, and we haven't just stayed within the Commonwealth. We've partnered with the European Students' Union, we partnered with the African Students' Union, and this is how we're bringing our collective voices together. And I want to tell young people to bring their collective voices together to pressure decision makers, because they are not listening, as we can see. It is absolutely horrifying that only 0.13% of the funding has gone to the most vulnerable population. And most of the funds have gone to corporations and multinational organizations to bail them out, to make sure that they do not go into deficit, which is just disappointing. Which is disappointing from a young person's perspective. So world leaders need to do better, because as much as they are ignoring the vulnerable communities right now, we are all going to be paying the price for this in the coming generations, and we cannot afford to let that happen.
Very, very articulately said, and I thank you very much for that. So realize, organize, mobilize, use your organizations, don't ask for permission, don't allow to be taken in a tokenistic fashion. Thank you very much. Great message in there. Rigoberta, Dr. Menchu, you've never asked anyone's permission in terms of organizing and raising your voice and seeking justice. What is your answer to the question about your advice to young people today about organizing and making sure that and also to governments, making sure there's space and voice for young people?
En primer lugar, yo planteo que comprendamos un nuevo reto, una encrucijada histórica que nos plantea la pandemia. Nos marcó un antes y un después. Y en ese después tenemos que impulsar un nuevo pacto social, No es posible continuar con lo que venimos trayendo cuando todas las instituciones cayeron, cuando todas las políticas públicas se quedaron sin efecto, y sobre todo en los países donde se tomaron medidas como estados de sitio, como toques de queda, que nos quedamos en un mundo dictatorial pero sin enemigo visible. Luego creo que es necesario hacer nuevos diálogos, y en esos diálogos no van a ser solo los funcionarios públicos o los gobiernos, sino va a ser un diálogo social con la diversidad social, con los diversos contextos sociales y con las diversas experiencias. Yo creo que es importante crear nuevos observatorios nacionales, que los jóvenes nos involucremos en Jóvenes en Acción, que tomemos las iniciativas por nuestras manos en la observación, en la tarima de control, especialmente la aplicación de los fondos públicos, pero sobre todo los préstamos. En América Latina se han hecho millonarios préstamos en nombre de las víctimas de la pandemia, y sin embargo no vemos absolutamente presencia de estos préstamos en las comunidades. Yo plantearía entonces una renovación de la organización juvenil, una renovación de la organización de mujeres, de la organización de los pueblos indígenas, reclamar una participación, pero no una participación solo para denunciar los hechos, sino para tomar acción y ser parte de esta nueva encrucijada que nos presenta la pandemia. Yo estoy invitando a la juventud a que participemos y que reclamemos una agenda en la que se visualicen las mujeres, se visualicen los pueblos indígenas, se visualicen los niños y las niñas, en donde se visualicen la discapacidad o la diversidad étnica o la diversidad generacional. En este departamento donde yo estoy, los perdedores más grandes de esta pandemia son los ancianos que nunca tuvieron nada y actualmente pues ya ni familia tienen. Entonces sí hay una emergencia humanitaria, pero en esa emergencia humanitaria no debe ser cooptado por la corrupción. Aquí el otro problema que es parte de la pandemia es la corrupción, es la impunidad, es la violación profunda a los derechos humanos. Entonces la juventud tiene mucho que hacer en su lucha contra la corrupción. Y gracias por la oportunidad. Yo tendría muchas sugerencias, pero lo más importante es tomar la acción y no solamente quedar en la expectativa.
First of all, I would say that we need to understand the new challenges. We are at a historic crossroads. This is what the pandemic has brought along. We can set a before and after panorama for the pandemics, and we need to foster a new social covenant. We need to understand that before COVID, all institutions had collapsed. Policies were not effective. And in some countries where they had implemented measures like curfew, they became some sort of dictatorial states without a visible enemy. So we need in this post-COVID era, we need to understand that public officials need to see this new situation with the lens of social diversity. They need to incorporate each context as it is and understand that each different experience. It is very important that the youth help create national watchdog organizations, and the youth must take action in them. The youth can, by their actions, participate in initiatives to control public funds. They need to take control of what is visible about public funding, specifically loans, because in Latin America, loans that account for millions have been used to help the victims of the pandemics. But we don't see the effects of those loans on the ground in different communities. So my proposal is to invite the youth to renew how they organize themselves, and not only by themselves, but also to organize with the women. I propose that this new organization invites the youth, women, indigenous peoples, and not only to claim a space for them. It is not only to organizing ourselves to denounce, but to take action, to be part of this new reality that the pandemic brings along. I would like to invite the youth to define an agenda that makes women, indigenous people, children, people with disability, individuals representing different ethnic groups and different generation visible. The department where I am, which is the Quiché department in Guatemala, well, the population that has lost the most are the elders, because they didn't have anything before. Right now, they don't even have their families with them. So this points out to a humanitarian emergency. But this humanitarian emergency is not only due to the pandemics, it is due also to corruption. And in this situation, we have to turn our eyes to fight impunity and corruption. And this is another area where I would invite the youth to participate. And impunity and corruption create deep human rights violations. And this is where youth can participate in this struggle to eradicate corruption. I thank you for this opportunity, and I have many more other suggestions to continue in this struggle, but I would like to invite you to take action.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing more of those watchdogs, all the money alliances with the women's movement, with the indigenous peoples movement, but also intergenerationally in terms, that's a very important point. So I'm really glad, and it's some good work for the 100 Million campaign to take on. Ulrik, so we have the issue of voice, but you also have a question that came out here that I have in front of me from someone who's watching about the acceleration of the divide in terms of economic access to education, and from an OECD perspective, what can we do to protect the most vulnerable?
Well, thanks, and I saw the question. Thank you to Scott Cunningham for that as well. I'll try to answer both of them at the same time. I think this is a shared responsibility, and it's good to hear that there is a great appetite among the younger generation, as we just heard, to take matters into their own hands. They can't just wait for others to define their destiny. So stronger youth voice, stronger youth organization, the use of social media, and all the other means available, I think, is the first part of it. The second part is then, of course, also that the rest of the political environment has to pay attention to these issues. We have in the OECD something we call youth and child-sensitive policy making, which means that we need a whole-of-government approach to issues that affect children and youth differently than others. We cannot just expect that policies made for adults will not have adverse side effects for children and youth. So we need a special focus on that. They are future adults, they are future workforce, they are future leaders. So again, I think it's a shared responsibility. And the specific question from Scott Cunningham, I think there is, of course, an economic inequality issue here that affects access to education, and that's I think that is what is alluded to when you talk about economic access. But then there is also what you said, Dr. Edwards, in the beginning, which becomes even more important during a crisis like this one when schools have to close, and that's the digital divide. There are big inequalities in terms of access, digital access, internet access to computers. So this means that the vulnerable are left behind when we go from physical attendance of school to e-learning or remote learning. In some instances, this can work for a period of time, but if you don't have access to the internet or access to a computer, you're completely lost in a crisis like this one. So I would say that there's a dual gap situation here. There's the economic inequality, and then there's the digital divide as well, and we need to address both.
Can I just do a follow-up to that? Because Rigoberta came up with the issue too, in terms of the fact that some folks are making a lot of money off the stimulus in terms of the loans that are being made. And we've seen in the report that the campaign put out that a lot of the money that was going to sort of bail out companies was going to sort of, I don't know, stock buybacks and things like that. Does the OECD put out recommendations to governments in terms of making sure that when they're putting out the stimulus that it's going to not sort of benefit companies, but to benefit people?
Look. Let's not make this more divisive than it should be. It's in the interest of everyone in society, also youth and children, that in this critical stage we also give life support to companies. If we don't do that, the economy will break, and we know what happens then. We will have even more inequality, and that will hurt the vulnerable, be they youth, children, women, refugees, or so on. So I would very much warn against the conclusion from this panel that we should not provide life support to companies that are central to society, to employment, and so on, because the ripple-on effects for children would be even worse. Having said that, we certainly do advise at the OECD, and as I also said in my 3 minutes, we do advise that you have to invest in education, you have to invest in children, and we know that after this crisis there will be competing pressures on government budgets because we're spending so much now. Some of this that has to be paid back, so there will be a competition between caring for the elderly, climate change action, pensions, paying back the loans that we're taking now, children, and so on. And we have a very clear advice that we should keep on investing in children. It's an investment that pays itself back. It's not only a moral obligation; it's actually also sound economics. So let's not make false divisions here. We need to do both.
No, it's fine. I was just referring to the report that was saying that more was being spent on bailing out the airline industry than going to all countries in the developing world together, and just sort of that type of number is just so striking. But I take the point. I think that's very clear. So thank you very much. Edvardas, OBESSU organization brings together the voices of secondary students. What can we do more in terms of making sure in student voice? What do you recommend to us? What should we be doing?
Thank you again. So from our experience, from OBESSU experience, 5 decades of working and telling the leaders that students should have a say at all decisions, from our experiences, only when you give students an opportunity to actually have a seat and actually discuss, only then they realize that we can be knowledgeable, we can be skilled, and we do have something to say. Before then, most of the time, young people are put tokenistically at the table, and from our experience, that's what works best, giving an opportunity. And then I agree very much with the previous speaker about access to education and how much it divides the society and how much it creates unequal opportunities. And I can refer again to the civil space in education, which I mentioned at the beginning. Most students don't have access to digital devices, but some do. That's why giving more civil space, actually asking students if they have access or not, might give more flexibility and more access to education for everyone. So say, for instance, in one class, half of them might not have access to devices, and they will have to stay, and maybe they could stay at school following the social distancing guidelines, but the other half could be studying from the comfort of their own home. That way you solve the issue for the entire class of students. So basically just giving more civil space for students and hearing them out and being more flexible, and more school pupils have access to school.
Thank you very much. So we have a question here for Dr. Reza from Ashura Michael. And this is now we're going to kind of go from the macro into the micro, a little bit about schools and education itself. The Global Education Modeling Report actually put out their latest version looking at inclusion and the impact on people with disabilities and students with disabilities. And this question goes to that. How can we ensure classes online during COVID are accessible to persons with disabilities? As chairperson of the Commonwealth Students Association, have you done research or raised concerns on those with disabilities? Dr. Reza?
Well, thank you, Ashura, for that question. That's a very, very valid question. I think this, the aspect of accessibility has a very wide spectrum. So when we look at what we're facing now, we are facing very horribly a digital divide where we see a large proportion of young people and children not having access to internet and not having access to devices, not having access to tablets or mobile phones or anything that they can use to access those online classes. So that is one big problem. So we're, as CSA, we're actually pushing governments to look into this issue and provide free tablets, provide free devices to children and young people that are currently not able to access schools and currently are locked out of schools. We're also pushing governments to enhance their internet connectivity, making web pages, learning web pages, Blackboard, for instance, making it zero-rated websites so that students and young people, they can go onto those websites without having to pay for it. So there are different processes that different governments can take, but I think it's also multiple levels of partnership. Governments need to, again, partner with student groups, student unions, youth organizations, non-profit organizations, NGOs, and also other private companies. They have to partner with private corporations as well, like telecommunication companies, to ensure that access is provided to the most rural, to the most vulnerable communities. And this is the time that we need to ensure that we maximize on digitizing different countries, digitizing all of our countries so that we can access basic elements like the internet and technology, something that should have been done a long time ago. But now we're seeing the problem that we're facing while the world is actually, overnight moving into digitization and moving into using internet and using online classes as a means of delivering education. We're seeing a huge proportion of students that are left out. Now, moving into the portion of students with disabilities, I think I'd like to highlight some of the quite amazing things that some of the institutions that I work with are doing. And for example, University of Exeter, and where I was coming from initially, University of East Anglia, when they upload notes, when they upload lectures, lecture notes or videos, there are processes where they ensure that there is accessibility. If a person is unable to read or unable to see, there are screen readers to describe those images. There are screen readers to explain what image means, describe that image to the person, or read the entire notes for them. So there are various processes, softwares that are being integrated into the systems to ensure that those students who have challenges in access and ability are able to learn just as well. And one thing that was really nice that University of Exeter is also doing is that they are providing individual attention. It's taking a lot of man and woman power to get this done, but they're really going into, surveys and one-to-one interaction to find out the needs and accessibility of students. Are they ready for the online learning? A new semester is coming up for universities. Are they ready for online learning? Are they ready? Do they have the devices? Where are they going to be? Are they going to have access to campus? So that kind of individual tutor to student engagement is really helping us get an idea and get an insight into the status of their accessibility towards technology, even their mental health, and whether they are able to learn in the best possible way. So I think that attention needs to be provided. But for that to happen, I think a lot of resources and funding needs to go into that. A lot of time and resources need to go into that. And I think governments leaders really need to make that commitment towards education and ensuring accessibility. Because the more people we leave behind right now, we are going to face a bigger consequence in the future, and we will have to pay for it. This will not go unnoticed.
Thank you. Edvardas, there's a question to you from Emily Vargas Varo. How do we push large corporations to accept fiscal, environmental, and social responsibility so that funding is available for the public sector, public education? Because currently large corporations do not have good transparency. That question is for you.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Emily, for the question. I think my colleague from OECD might help me out after my intervention, after what I say. But I think you can approach this problem from two ways. So the first one, you can have some transnational tax regulations, so there would be no tax havens, as they are called in public. But it's hard because in that case, countries lose their sovereignty to have a comparative advantage over states. So say, for instance, if I'm a poor state and I want any share of taxes at all, and I have high moral standards and my tax is like 5%, I will have a lot of investment to my country because I will have a comparative advantage over all other states. So I think when it comes to this problem, it comes down to public awareness and making actually states aware of the cost, cost at large scale, world cost, that it imposes when you have tax havens or tax avoidance in general. Billions of dollars are lost every year to tax avoidance, and that money could be used to fund education and public sector. And that's another way of looking at this problem, which is, I think it was made in Denmark when the government said, if you want our funding, if you want our subsidies, you have to meet this list of criteria, eligibility criteria, saying that in the next 5 years you will commit to becoming more environmentally sustainable, you will commit in becoming socially responsible. If they don't commit, they're just obliged, if they take the governmental money, they're obliged to becoming more transparent and becoming more socially responsible or environmentally responsible. But I think this is the expertise where my colleague from OECD is much more knowledgeable. So maybe we could. That's
a good idea. Thank you very much. Let's go to Ulrik. So this kind of builds on what we were talking about before around what kind of conditionalities can be built in to make sure that the resources are going to benefit students. So I know you do a lot of work on BEPS and base erosion and following this with the DAC and other places. What's the OECD take on this?
Exactly, and I think at the heart of Emily's question is how do we secure the adequate funding for education? And I would maybe start somewhere else and say that I think this is an obligation in democracies for the state and the government. It's the government and the state we should look for to provide education. In some countries also there's some degree of private education, but it is the responsibility of the state and the government in a democracy to provide education for all. Emily also introduces the question of the large multinational corporations. How do we get them on board? Well, again, there are two ways. One is that we make sure that they contribute through taxes to that overall end of government responsibilities, where one is providing education. And on that, we are working in OECD, as you said, with the BEPS, and we have a very important digital tax negotiation going on at the OECD now. The issue of how to tax the largest multinational companies in the world, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, but not only them, actually also non-digital companies. That's a hugely important negotiation going on right now. There are countries in the world who are impatient with it and are threatening to move on their own and tax these digital giants if we do not get agreement in the negotiations in the OECD. So that's one way. The other one is that many of these companies, as was mentioned by the previous speaker, who kindly handed it over to me to answer, is I think that we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years an increase in what we used to call company responsibility, which is that some of these corporations are increasingly taking upon themselves also to do something for social purposes or environmental purposes. I think the problem for education here is that sustainable development and the greening of our economies and the climate challenge is perhaps the favored one right now among these corporations, and not so many maybe engaging in education. So that leads me back to where I began. We cannot rely on the multinational companies on their own to provide funds for education. We have to have a solid tax base, and I agree also with the last part of the question that was on the screen, that this also means transparency in tax and accountancy and so on.
And you have Jennifer Rigg, I know from the Global Campaign for Education in the United States, I recognize, who was asking you about disability and making sure that countries are also, but you were speaking to that. We're coming low on time now. And I think this last question to Maisha, Reza, about what world leaders need to do at the UN General Assembly is really important. Because right now we are in front of a world UNGA like no other in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what is it that world leaders need to do? What's the one thing that the UN General Assembly to ensure that those that are most vulnerable get their fair share of the global COVID-19 response? Dr. Reza?
I think countries that are the wealthier countries, they need to contribute. They need to pay their fair share. I think we have become, as a society, very selfish and very self-serving. So this is the time where we need to extend our hands. Countries that are wealthier need to make their contribution to try and reduce the debt and deficits of countries that are poorer and countries that need assistance. And I think that one message that I would give to world leaders when they come together to UN at the UNG is to dedicate that 20%, just 20% of their COVID relief fund, of their funds, of the investments that they're making to save their economy to the world's most vulnerable population, to their communities that are most vulnerable. So to put it very simply, just one thing, dedicate that 20% of your relief funds to the 20% of the world's most vulnerable communities. And I'll leave it at this.
Thank you very much. I want to bring this to a close, and I want to thank all the panelists, I think, for really bringing some important ideas to the fore, for framing them, for helping us go from sort of both the macro to the micro and at the school level. I think what I have heard is a real recognition of the need for there to be alliances that are formed, for political will to be also met with real world policies and changes, that states take responsibility for providing public education, that tax obligations are met, that citizens' voice is respected, that alliances are built between movements of indigenous women, students, the elderly, the environmental movement, but it's going to take not just different advocates at fighting for their single their single issue, but to see the way in which there's an intersectoral connection of all of this, and that all citizens and all rights holders are going to have to come together in order to be able to marshal the political will, put the pressure, and also take the lead in terms of what comes next and what is going to benefit students. Because quite frankly, what we're facing right now is not acceptable. What this COVID pandemic has revealed is not acceptable morally, ethically, economically, or from any perspective. This is a fantastic panel. I really want to thank Kailash and the laureates and leaders for the opportunity to have moderated it. I want to thank Dr. Maisha Reza, Dr. Rigoberta Menchu, Ulrik Knudsen, and Edvardas Vabuolas for a fabulous discussion. And we look forward to further conversations with all of you, and the best of luck for the continuing portions of this important summit. Thank you all very much.
Please enjoy this musical performance by Jasmine Grace Grimaldi, 100 Million Campaign's Global Ambassador.
Thank you.
I know you all share the same sentiment as me, and I am so grateful for that. Please, let's continue to raise our voices, uplift one another, educate, and stand behind the promises that we made for our children, today and every day. The time is now. Let's do it.
Looking in the mirror, wondering what comes next. Slip into my armor, wear it like a black dress. Oh, 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 oh. Ready for for the glances, flying like opinions. Every game or battle, I think I'm gonna win this one. Cause honey, they have knocked me down before, but I just keep coming back for more. I'm shattering the ceiling, breaking walls. No more hate, cause love conquers all. I can be fearless, I can be fragile, I can be complicated and a little bit wild. Some days I'm falling, oh, some days I fly, oh, I fly, cause I can be anything, I don't apologize. Just another day, walk steady like the sunrise. Millionaires surround me, they got something I recognize. Oh, oh, oh. There's a little hurt mixed with a little mischief, been part of the cycle. We're ready to fix this now. Oh, oh, oh. I thought I was alone, but we're all the same. You held it in and never showed my pain. I'm shattering the ceiling, breaking walls. No one thinks love, it conquers all. I can be fearless, I can be fragile, I can be complicated and a little bit wild. Some days I'm falling, or some days I fly, oh, I fly, cause I can be anything, I don't apologize. Thought I was but we're all the same, yeah. I held it in, yeah, but I never showed my pain, oh. Looking in the mirror, wondering what comes next. Slip into my armor, wear it like a black dress. There's a little hurt mixed with a little mischief, been part of the cycle. We're ready to fix this now. We can be fearless, we can be fragile, we can be complicated and a little bit wild. Wild. Some days we fall, and some days we fly. Oh, we fly, cause we can be anything, we don't apologize. We can be fearless. Woo!
Today's second thematic panel about children on the move is about to begin, moderated by the president of the Robert Francis Kennedy Human Rights Organization, Miss Kerry Kennedy.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be with you all today, and especially great to be with Kailash Satyarthi, one of my closest friends, and as always, one of my heroes, and really happy to be with our incredible panel today. You know, this conference is focused on the impact of COVID-19 on marginalized children. Everyone on today's panel has devoted their lives to addressing monumental human suffering, and all of you have deep expertise on the vulnerabilities of children on the move. As we've heard at this conference, the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated human lives, the global economy, and the educational systems. Given the enormous financial hardship on families, the closing of schools, the increase in human trafficking, the sexual exploitation, the domestic violence, and the slavery, children on the move are more at risk than ever. Add to all of this smaller government budgets because of fewer taxes, border closings, lack of access to clean water, overcrowding in refugee camps, and the skepticism, well-founded skepticism of many refugees about the consequences of accessing healthcare even when it is available to them. Under these conditions, multidisciplinary interventions coupled with innovation and technology and entrepreneurial thinking must remain the priority. We are all aware of the challenges. Let's start in this panel by looking at the solutions. I'd like to ask each of the panelists to describe one moment in your career where you saw systemic change. Tell us what happened and what's the lesson learned from your experience that we can apply today to children on the move. And let's start with Philip Jennings. Philip Jennings is the co-president of the International Peace Bureau, which was the 1910 Nobel Peace Prize winning organization. Since the onset of the pandemic, the IPB has argued for improvements in healthcare infrastructure, as well as services, and demanded the world to draw lessons from the crisis to ensure that every child has access to food, shelter, education, healthcare, and is protected from all forms of exploitation, such as child labor, human trafficking, and abuse. President Jennings is a man known not only as one of the world's most prominent trade union leaders, but also as a man with a long history of obtaining concrete results on behalf of people who are living in extraordinary vulnerability. His work in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza disaster is legendary, making companies with exploitive supply chains agree to major change. So, President Jennings, could you give us an example of a time you created change and what those lessons are for people on the move facing COVID today?
What I'd like to say is to call on the inspiration of John Lewis, the recently deceased civil rights activist in the United States of America, who said you have to say something and do something and make good trouble. So I spent my union life making good trouble, and one of the areas of good trouble that I made was in the work against child labor. This was something that grew in prominence, particularly in the 80s and in the 1990s. And we came across the occurrence of child labor, and we decided to do something about it. And when we look at the moment today, when we have the universal ratification of a global convention which makes exploitation of child labor illegal, we've come a long way. At the beginning, we were told we were naive, that that's the way that things were, that things won't change, that cultures were set. And we changed the world and changed the consciousness. We changed the world of business to the extent that we now have much more sense of their responsibility towards people and the planet. And I hope to see a new global treaty for due diligence. I now wear a peace hat. And what has struck me in my work in peace is the extent of the violence that faces children, and particularly children on the move. And I've been struck by the fact that in this world today, there are 168 armed conflicts, 15 wars, and 23 what they call limited wars. 1 in 10 children are living in zones of conflict. This is not spoken about. And therefore, we have this enormous peace deficit, which COVID-19 only makes worse. I was told I was naive all those years ago, and now I'm going to be probably accused of the same. What we have to do is to make good trouble for a sustainable peace. I want these leaders and laureates to talk about peace, and that we're not naive and foolish to talk about peace. I want us to back up the UN Secretary General when he says that we need a global ceasefire. This global ceasefire runs out at the end of September. We need a global ceasefire. Let's do it. We need to question the amount of money spent on the military. $1.9 trillion is spent on our military. 0.53% of that military expenditure is the equivalent to what the world is spending in its COVID response for the most vulnerable of children. To prohibit nuclear weapons, to take on those governments that are calling for a ceasefire with one side of their mouth, and secondly, supplying arms to Saudi Arabia and others, which are used to target civilians and children and schools and hospitals. We need a new social contract. We need a new sense of the importance of migrant workers in our lives. Let us remember as well as that those people on the front lines today are the adult children of once children on the move. These people work in hospitals, in cleaning, in security, in transport. They take care of us. They've lost their lives for us. And I would like to challenge the leaders and laureates as they bring their passion and commitment to help children on the move, to make a brand new deal for these migrants, to make them fellow citizens. We were told many years ago that we couldn't do it. We can get this job done. A global ceasefire, peace, and a new attention given to migrant workers and the role that they play. We bring our energy to this. The IPB is the world's oldest NGO. We've spoken all this time about the dangers that war brings to children. Please carry in the conclusions. And when the Congress finishes this evening, peace, sustainable peace, has to be the message from us to the world.
Okay, thank you very, very much, President Jennings, for that great and energizing opening remarks. I'm going to move now to a dear friend of mine, Prince Ali, His Royal Highness Prince Ali bin Al-Hussein of Jordan. But before I get to Prince Ali, I'm just going to say to our panelists, look around this room. How great are all the people on our panel? But you know what? We have 48 minutes. So you see a little clock at the bottom, and it says 3 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to be really, really disciplined about sticking within that 3 minutes. If you're not, you're going to get this from me. Okay. So that means move along so we can hear the other panelists and get some audience Q&A. Just that little point. But thank you very much. And Prince Ali, who's, as I said, a dear friend, has an incredible educational background, a long career in the military, where he established the National Center for Security and Crisis Management for the Kingdom of Jordan. But for today's discussion, we want to talk about his incredibly innovative program to promote child development, women's rights, and unity throughout the region through football. As president of the Jordan Football Association, Prince Ali has brought football to students across the region in 13 different countries, always promoting good governance and transparency. And I was lucky enough to join Prince Ali and watch his program in action at one of the refugee camps in Jordan. The last time we had the laureates, he and Jordan hosted the Laureates and Leaders Conference in his home. So, Prince Ali, in your work with refugees, what have you learned about creating concrete change?
Well, thanks so much, Carrie, and it's a real honor to be with you here. And I'll be as quick as possible. We got the memo. First of all, as you mentioned with football, we are using that platform, especially during this COVID crisis, as leaders in how to organize communities within camps. But I thought, according to your first question, that and I had taken some notes of some of the issues that refugees are facing. And how they would, and some of the solutions that they would like. So if you don't mind, just go through them. The first thing is poverty. The incomes of families have gone down. Poverty has gotten even worse, especially when it comes to cash. The decline in migrant remittances, and many refugees who had temporary jobs have lost them. So let us note that extreme poverty is considered a form of violence. So we could say that right now there's an act of violence and injustice being committed against children on the move in particular. The already precarious situation of refugee children has been exacerbated by COVID-19. More government support is needed and direct financial support, not just for NGOs, but also for small businesses, owners owned by refugees, workers who have been laid off, such as agricultural workers or artisans and refugee families. Professor Mohammed Yunus said yesterday that children are not isolated. In most cases, they have families, so family programs will help children. However, in the case of refugee children, many of them are already orphaned or separated from their families, and more might be orphaned because of COVID. Secondly, in terms of their survival and health, the health system has been weakened and disrupted. There's less or no access to healthcare or sanitation and water. There is zero possibilities of isolation if needed in cases of contamination. And children with disabilities are also particularly vulnerable. There is in the region, and with the exception of Jordan, where refugees have full access to our health services and education, a need for children to be fully integrated into the health systems of countries, especially in this time, and that is urgent. There should be no discrimination towards immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. Also, the priority for a potential vaccine, as we know and has been mentioned earlier, should go to those most in need, that most particular populations on the move, and children in particular. Early on in the crisis, Kailash Ji, yourself, myself, and other colleagues and friends called for the world to give 20% of the fair share of COVID-19 relief to the 20% most marginalized in the world. We are all here calling on that again and must raise our voices to implement this. Thirdly, and I have one more after this, during COVID, the education system has taken a real blow. Refugee teachers are often not part of the national education system, also more vulnerable to the cessation of salaries and job losses while schools are not in session. Failures of non-state schools, either now or in the future, would lead public education systems to absorb high numbers of additional students. It's the greatest risk of a lost generation than before, and we need to address this so we don't have a downward spiral. After all, who will rebuild their countries if they return, and how can they contribute to the countries to which they are moving? And the solution is urgent funding needed to pay teachers within refugee communities or volunteers, and also to offer children digital access to learning with protection against inappropriate content for children, integrating refugee children with the national education systems where possible. And lastly, protection and safety. During COVID, the situation is even more precarious. No support, there's abuse on the rise. Adolescent girls especially are at risk of abuse and forced into early marriage and trafficking. And violence against children has increased. By the way, this is happening in developing countries. So imagine the situation in cramped refugee camps and communities, and as well as the fact that many of these children are separated from their families. The solution is to make social services available and maintain essential social service staff to areas housing refugees and immigrant communities. Try whenever possible, as per a model that I use, to recruit these workers from the refugee communities themselves. I'm talking about services that help with food, support that can check homes and talk with women, especially if essential staff is reduced by COVID. And all countries need to stop family separation and to stop turning back asylum seekers or blocking refugees' access to stable conditions. And finally, the bottom line is no one is safe until everybody is safe. This should not only apply to COVID measures, it should apply to children on the move who are denied any education and who live in poverty and therefore live precarious lives. Their existence is constantly threatened. We cannot underestimate the deficit of hope as well. Refugees and children in many cases are often found in limbo, where neither host countries or countries of origin choose to accept them. In recent times, we've even seen politicians try to deny their very existence for political expediency. We must constantly remind those politicians that yes, they are us, yes, they exist, and yes, they are here. And finally, response to COVID and protection of children on the move should not be seen as a reaction to a crisis. So these measures are urgent regarding COVID-19 and can be a benchmark for, at the very least, we should be dealing with children on the move, not just now, but in the future. And I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prince Ali, for that great summing up of many of the overall issues that are faced by refugees. And now, we believe that people who are closest to the problems are closest to the solution. And that's a great description of our next speaker, our next panelist. Like Like Prince Ali, Seme Ludanga Faustino works directly with refugees. He's the co-founder of ICANN South Sudan, a registered refugee-led organization in Uganda that engages unaccompanied refugee children in social and musical activities to heal them of trauma. Seme is a person who has lived experience of being a refugee. So tell us how you see COVID impacting your community and what a good partnership would look like to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. I am privileged to be in this meeting. And yeah, COVID-19 has really impacted children, more especially the unaccompanied, so much negatively. And, you know, these children, they go through physical, social distress now, since schools and other places or spaces which help children to develop. And then they're all closed. And these children are all pushed home, and they stay with their parents. And some of them, they're already traumatized. So by being in school and being in child-friendly spaces, this is where they engage and they heal their trauma. But now, since schools are closed, they are more exposed into trauma. And then these children are also finding difficulties as they're at home. They are exposed into different violence, abuses, and neglect in the midst of COVID-19 because they are exposed into those things because they are not anymore engaged into any other thing. They are just home, and these are children who need more engagement within schools and within their child-friendly spaces. And then we look into also these children in a way that some of them are separated from their caregivers. Their caregivers, these are also refugees. And these are people who always also look for survival. Sometimes they cross over to their original country, and the COVID-19 lock them there, the lockdown find them there, and they're not able to come back. That means they are separated, and they are more exposed to sexual abuse, and they're also exposed into slavery because these are children whom these caretakers are supposed to be taking care of them. But now their caretakers are not there and no one is taking care of them. That means they will be forced to move to the street, and anyone can get them there and start using them, more especially the girls, sexually, or they can be given into child labor because nobody is taking care of them, and someone will take the advantage of using them to give them, to use them as a source of support. And I look into how we can solve this situation of these unaccompanied children. One of it is that we should look into supporting the caregivers, because these caregivers, some of them are thinking that they will be supported. They will be supported when they receive or when they take care of this unaccompanied. But realizing that they are not supported, they tend to push away these children. So we have to look into a way of supporting them. And then the second thing is that we need to provide permanent space where these children are to be kept, than giving them also to people who are also refugees, who also survive narrowly. So this is what I look into, and I want to end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and especially for speaking as somebody who's really lived this experience. Your words mean so much to all of us. Our next speaker is Josie Naughton. She is the co-founder and CEO of Help Refugees, which is a nonprofit organization funding over 100 projects across Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. Josie, you have done just extraordinary work about bringing people together on the cause of refugees, and especially at a time when there was such a rise in hate crimes and in, fanning political flames against political refugees across Europe. So what do you think it will take to gain the power of youth to address the impact of COVID-19 on children across the world?
Wow, thank you so much. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be on this panel, and I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed listening to everyone so far and agree with everything everyone has said. Help Refugees, Choose Love started 5 years ago in response to the refugee crisis in 2015 as it hit Europe. 1 million people at that time were fleeing for their lives, looking for sanctuary. And we were just a group of ordinary people watching the news, heartbroken to be seeing the images, and went online to try and raise £1,000 to buy tents and sleeping bags for Calais in northern France, and that link went viral, and before we knew it, within a week we had 7,000 packages arriving from Amazon every single day. We'd raised over £56,000, and we went to Calais expecting to find the big organisation to hand all of this stuff over to, and there was no big organisation working there. There were 5,000 people living in a field with nothing. I met a boy who was turned out to be an unaccompanied minor. I didn't even know that children could be alone. And so we decided that we would rent a warehouse. We started a distribution system, a shelter building program, and we used social media to get people to come and show their support. And over the last 5 years, we've ended up raising over £30 million, funding 125, as you say, different projects all along the route. And it's all based on people power. We've had over 30,000 volunteers through us and our partners' programs. People do really care. And so much of what we see on the ground is political. It's a political nightmare. The last 2 days I have been, our organisation is one of the primary funders of all of the organisations working on Lesvos. Moria camp, which has been home to 13,000 people, has burnt down over the last 2 days. And in that camp, there were over 4,000 children who were with their families, and another 500 or so unaccompanied minors. They have been living in the most unbearable conditions, and now this fire has just made everything considerably worse. And what's an incredible thing that's happened in the last 24 hours is that 400 of the unaccompanied minors have been transferred to the mainland and are hopefully going to be going to new homes in countries across Europe. But some of those children have been there for years, and it just shows that when there's the political will, the change and support for these human beings, for these children, can happen. And it's heartbreaking how intentional that was. And I think the only way that we are going to see the change that we need to see, and COVID is exacerbating everything, as we've heard, is by politicians listening to people, and people have to be shouting loudly about what's happening, because the solutions can be there. And I think young people, I'm constantly inspired by all the young people who are volunteering, doing fundraisers for us, who are writing to politicians, who want to see a change in the world. And I think as long as we're telling human stories, that change is coming. At least I have to believe that it is.
Thank you so much, Josie, and I agree with you. It's those human stories that touch our soul and really make people respond. And you've done such an extraordinary job, both at bringing those stories to life, but also at really helping people on the ground. Another person who has done much the same in her own way is Jody Williams. She's the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for her work for the international treaty banning landmines in 1997. And Ms. Williams has chaired the Nobel Women's Initiative with the mission to support and amplify the efforts of women around the world working for sustainable peace with justice and equality. Jody, you have been on the front lines of social change from the U.S. interventions in Central America all the way to today for decades and decades. And you have also taught the next generation. Tell us what you've learned along the way about making change work, and especially for refugees. Okay. Looks like we're having trouble hearing you. Jody, is your speaker on? Yeah, you. Is your speaker on? So I'll tell you what, we're going to move along to Mariana Vardinoyanis, and meanwhile, our incredible team will work on getting Jody up and running. So Mariana Vardinoyanis, let me just start by saying, is one of my best friends in the world. I'm so happy to be with you. She is the UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, and she and the United Nations gave her the UN Nelson Mandela Prize just this year. Mariana has fought against cancer in children for more than 30 years, helping thousands of diseased kids. She created the first pediatric oncology hospital in Greece, known as Elpida. If anyone's ever in Athens, you've got to go and see this hospital. It is like no place else on earth. She advocates for the protection of human rights, children and families, people in need, and especially refugees in Greece. And she oversees the Robert F. Kennedy Speak Truth to Power Human Rights Education Program in Greece, which features both Jody Williams and Kailash Satyarthi, and Rigoberta, Menchu, and many other people on this call, on this conference. Mariana, we were just hearing about Lesbos, and I know you've been there and you've helped the children there. You've worked in refugee camps across Greece, and you were really one of the first prominent people in Greece to do so. You've helped countless families through the terrifying crisis of losing a child to cancer, and you've devoted your life to helping the most vulnerable. Tell us about your experience and what we can learn from it in facing the COVID-19 crisis.
Dear Clary, thank you very much. You are a great human rights activist that I admire you deeply through our long-lasting friendship. Concerning, if you like to start telling me about Moria, I would like to say that we are devastated. I cannot find words to describe how sad we feel. What we sadly see unfolding in Moria, the refugee camp in the Greek island of Lesbos, sends a warning signal to all of us. The camp was burned by fires caused by refugees who were found positive in COVID-19 tests and denied to stay in quarantine. No human being should live under such conditions. And on the other hand, no local community like that of the island of Lesbos should be so brutally affected. Neither Greece or any other state can lift this burden alone. Europe and the world community must seek sustainable solutions and pay special attention in the times of pandemic. I visited Lesbos a few years ago with Queen Rania, and found the conditions very good, especially in Karatepe. In Moria, the conditions were terrible. I cannot add anything else because, of course, this is a matter of they have to do this in our government has to look for this. I have to, if you want to tell you more, at this moment I have no more information about that.
Tell us about your experience and how you think we should, experience informs your thoughts about how we address COVID-19 for children across the world.
The pandemic has become a hard reality for many children around the world, and even today, some aspects have not been seen yet. Children on the move are among the most vulnerable human beings. They have suffered so much, and their lives are already marked by insecurity and psychological trauma. Because of the pandemic, their life gets even more difficult due to discriminations and xenophobia. Unemployment often forces parents to send their children to work and increase domestic violence. Many children are trafficked or forced in getting married. Orphan children are especially vulnerable to exploitation and social exclusion, as well are forced to become soldiers such in a small young age. Even before the pandemic, I think refugee children were twice as likely to be out of schools than other children. Now these children face more problems accessing classrooms or online lessons. Education is an essential life skill in crisis. Without it, they will be unable to learn their rights, to rebuild their lives, to achieve their full potential. We must ensure this crisis will not be widen learning inequalities, and in the global recovery from the pandemic, the right to education will be a priority, responsibility shared by all countries. In the effort for safe and accessible schools for all children, national strategies should place human rights at the heart of education. The Speak Truth to Power program of the Robert Kennedy Human Rights is one of the best examples, and our foundation is very proud of implementing it in the Greek schools. Moreover, many unaccompanied children are unprotected and live on the streets or in overcrowded structures. They often don't have the means to seek health care and social benefits. It is very important for them to be included in public health, information, education, and care programs. And certainly we must ensure free access to COVID-19 testing and vaccines for all. I would also like to pay special attention on two additional vulnerable groups: children suffering from serious diseases like cancer and children with disabilities. Their health condition is a great risk because of COVID-19, and they are completely dependent on their parents who face so many everyday problems together with the agony of their children's life. This family must be supported with special care by the states. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for your intervention. So appreciated, and from somebody who's really been on the front lines there. Now, it looks like we've lost Jody, and is Abraham Kita on this call? Can you wave if you're on here? Abraham, okay, great. Thank you so much. Abraham was born during Liberia's brutal civil war. His father was a driver for a humanitarian organization and was killed in an ambush when Kita was only 5 years old. Kita grew up in extreme poverty with his mothers and siblings in West Point, which is the largest slum in the country. And just as somebody who's actually been to West Point, really, I just can't even think of any place on this earth that's been quite as tough as where you grew up. So Pete has an incredible story of resilience and of activism, and has started a radio show and has done so much for his community to create change and to bring peace. But again, you know, as we say, those closest to the problems are closest to the solution. And it would be great to hear from you, Kita, about the way you see COVID-19 impacting your community and what a good partnership would look like.
Thank you so much for having me on this call. I do appreciate it. I've listened to the previous panelists, you know, give statistics and data. So I will not give statistics, but I will just remind, you know, the panelists and all of those who are watching this live event that beyond the statistics are real lives, and what is demanded of us in these unusual circumstances is to stand up for each other and be there for one another. When I was growing up, I faced a lot of difficulties. I have lived through poverty. I know what it is. I lived through Ebola in 2014. But growing up, I realized that appealing to political will is not enough. We must appeal to the moral consciences of people. And here's why I say this. When I was growing up, I was born up in a culture where I was taught that women and girls were less than men, and that this idea of being a female or being a male is to be weak, and then a male is somebody who is supposed to be strong. You're not supposed to have conversations with females. So I saw this has something very problematic, and as a young person, I said to myself, I'm not going to go back by society's this sort of societal construct that we have of being a female and a male, and how a man, you are supposed to be strong and show courage. So I was like, that is the problem that is wrong with our society, which is why we have all these different social problems like rape and sexual violence and domestic violence, because women and girls we have been told that they are lesser human beings. So I decided to stand up, especially when a 9-year-old girl was raped, or 13-year-old girl was raped in my community. And so sort of like using that story to connect it with the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, we are under a moral obligation to not just empathize in words, to not just express our concerns and support for people who are in danger, people who are on the move. We must do it by taking actions. We must ask ourselves, what is it that we can do to change the situation? Back in Liberia, I and my friends, we changed our entire system. We made sure that the government of Liberia enacted the children's law of Liberia, the first of its kind in history, and one of the first laws for children in Africa. That was something we did. Not because some of us were victims of the problem, because we saw the moral urgency to act. So for instance, refugees who are on the run, who are looking for home, nobody wants to leave their home where they were born, where they grew up, to just go to a foreign land where they don't know. So we must ask ourselves, what is it that they are running away from their different countries to the countries that is sick? By the time we connect that, then we can begin to open our borders and treat them with good heart and welcome them and treat them with open hearts. That is really what we have to do. And even with the ongoing COVID-19, it leaves children vulnerable. For instance, as economies around the world crumble, many people are losing their jobs. Here in the U.S., millions of people have lost their jobs. This leaves their children vulnerable to child labor, to child trafficking. And we should also look at children who will be orphaned as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. We should ask ourselves, what is it that we can do? Because if you don't take care of, if you don't put in measures that will absorb children who have been orphaned as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, some of them may end up being victims of child trafficking. So it is really each of us taking actions in our own ways to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Abraham. And now back to Jody Williams. Jody, so great to see you again. I just introduced you a few moments ago, but Nobel Peace Prize winner, peace activist, and somebody who's just been in the game for years and years, decades and decades, and teaching the next generation. So, Jody, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Carrie. Nice to see you again. I'm sorry for my technical difficulties. I wanted to just echo the words of Philip Jennings about the need to focus on peace. If we really want to deal with all of the issues of the world, we have got to change our thinking about where our resources should go. And I think this is echoing words of many throughout these 2 days as I've been listening. We know that it can be done. We know that it is possible to change thinking about weapons. For example, when we banned landmines, when cluster munitions were banned, nuclear weapons banned, but there's a long way to go on that one, certainly. These actions happen when huge coalitions of civil society start to work together, as Rigoberta Menchu mentioned. We need coalitions of people working toward the same end. However, if those coalitions do not also partner with governments that share the same point of view with international institutions, it is hard to bring about change. But when the political will is there, it is possible to bring about change. To weapons for 1 second, I look at the budget of the current administration in the United States alone, 57% of that budget, the discretionary budget, goes to the Pentagon, weapons, and war. 5% goes to education, and 7% goes to health. Just imagine in this COVID crisis, if I would say 49%, 50%, 60% of that money were dedicated to multilateral solution to COVID, we would have a much different world. But it can't be a one-off. What COVID has shown us, like other diseases, is that there are no impermeable borders anymore. Despite the myth of, the brave nation state with its impermeable border, that is a myth. And it is shown to be that more so and more so with cybersecurity issues, COVID, etc. If we do not work together for multinational and multi-institutional and multi-generational responses, the future is dim. But I know it can be done, and I am happy to do whatever I can to participate in any coalition to help make it happen. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So we have a few minutes, and I'd love our tech people to tell me here how many minutes we actually do have, but for questions. So the first question is from the UNHCR to Josie Naughton, and the question is, forcibly displaced children have been among the hardest hit by the worldwide disruption and movement restrictions due to COVID-19. The UNHCR continues to advocate with all governments that despite border closures, quarantines, and disruption of basic services, child protection services must be maintained and accessible as life-saving services. And critically, any movement restrictions must not separate children from their families. Given our understanding of the multiple impacts of COVID-19 on the situation of forcibly displaced and stateless children, what are 2 or 3 recommendations that you would make to the UNHCR to improve their lives in these extraordinary circumstances? You could choose that under operations or advocacy or anything else. Great question. Thank you.
Great question, and incredible to hear about the advocacy work of UNHCR, and it's an honor to work alongside UNHCR in so many of the contexts in which we work. I mean, that is a huge question. I think, just the very fact that there are children still living in camps during this time of, it's not just the medical threat that, as we've heard today, is affecting children. It is camps being put on lockdown. It's lack of access to the very most basic of services, even to food, lack of access to medical care. We need to be getting children unaccompanied and those with their families resettled and no longer living in dangerous camp environments that were dangerous before COVID and are even more so now. And as I said earlier, we can see that it is possible. It isn't, especially in Europe, there is no need for children to be living in camps. I think we have got to be thinking about the lack of access to education. prior to COVID, even though there have been so many international commitments about making sure that refugee children still have access to education, we so often see that they don't, and we are only able to fund informal education. So I think, I know it's already a priority, but I just want to reiterate how important that is. And then I think, as a grassroots organisation that works with other grassroots organisations, we shouldn't be doing this work. It's the organisations we work with are incredible, but it should be governments who are doing this work. It should be the government level international community. And so operationally, we need to have a big push to get governments to commit to funding and also operationalising programmes to support displaced communities. But really, they should be resettled and living in countries just as everybody else is.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, and again, I'm going to just ask everybody to keep your answers as quick as possible, just so everybody gets a chance to get their questions in. But Consuelo Contreras from Chile says, to the panel, in recent years, Chile has become an important recipient of migration in Latin America. What are the main elements that will help tackle the post-pandemic crisis, where we have deeper discrimination, the closure of borders, and the brutal lack of compassion? I might just ask Mariana Bardina-Llanos to talk about this, because this seems a little bit similar to the feeling that that was in Greece just a few years ago towards refugees, and how would you answer that question?
Sorry, Kerry, I didn't understand the question. What was the question? To talk about what? Sorry. Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Mariana. Okay, Mariana seems to have disappeared for the moment. So, no. Jody, do you want to talk about this, answer this question about Chile?
Me disappear.
I think it goes back to one of the things that I mentioned when I just spoke about the need to have national response to these kinds of problems. When, for example, in the Syria crisis, when people fled the country, understandably, at some point there was some sense of multilateral response throughout Europe. Some sense. It was not perfect by any stretch, but there was some effort to work together. Given climate change, given everything that is happening in the world, people will be on the move more and more. And if we don't work together, between nations, with the UN and other international organizations, it's going to be a mess. So we have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Mariana, you're back.
But I didn't understand your question. I didn't understand. I could not hear. It's very, very difficult to hear.
I see. Okay. Well,
the question, please.
Okay, so the question is basically how does a country like Chile, which is in a similar situation that Greece was in, grapple with the political upheaval of accepting refugees? That's
it is very difficult to answer to this question, because we have a big problem, with neighbors. You know that. What happened? We are trying our best. Kerry, both of us, we have visited the camps together during winter time, during summer times. I dedicated myself, and I have we have done many efforts. We created so many with UNESCO help us a lot on this project, but it's very difficult to give you an answer. I know that we have so many similarities to Chile. We are really passing very difficult times, and me personally, the first that you know better than me, that you have visited our country, so many countries, and as we were visiting the camps, I cannot tell you in this moment how is the situation. It's really bad, as you know, in Moria. But I don't believe that we have to do, if we are not helping from European Union, always we will have many, many problems, because every day, many refugees enter our country, and this is a real big problem, because our economical situation is this moment horrible because of the COVID. It's a great unemployment in our country. The Greek people are starving because they don't have work. The tourism was really disappointed this summer that all the incomes that we have is the tourism is because our country is a poor country. And can we understand how the Greek people also are hurt because they are starving, even our own people here in Greece now with the COVID. And so, but always the Greek people are all welcoming the foreigners, and especially who are coming, from Turkey and coming to our country, and we try to save them, because usually they come in very difficult weather. The weather is horrible sometimes, and you lose so many people. So I don't know what we are going to do, dearest Carrie. I'm really. We have a real big problem that I cannot give you a solution this moment.
Okay, thank you, Mariana. Let's move to this question for Prince Ali. Could you talk about how Jordan manages the schools at the Zaatari camp? And also, I'm just going to add my own question to that, because Prince Ali, you said that it's very, very important that people are not discriminated against based on where they're from, and that concept is almost unique to Jordan. Can you talk about how Jordan manages that concept with regard to refugees?
Sure. Yeah, look, in terms of the first question, and since the very beginning, and let's be honest, it's not our first experience with the refugees. I mean, we've had refugees from Palestinian refugees to Iraqis, to Palestinians and Jordanians who came back from Kuwait during the first Gulf War, and now obviously with Syrian refugees, and they are fully integrated into our own curriculum and school system, government school system. And in that respect, also, we put our teachers with them, Jordanian school teachers in the refugee camp, and we also educate their own teachers to our curriculum and to our system. Having said that, the majority of our refugees are actually outside of the camp and living within our communities as well. So in that respect, they do go to school, as do any other Jordanian, to be honest. The biggest problem, though, is they are in a difficult financial situation, including Jordanians, and it's coupled with COVID. So, for example, the other day, I mean, there are two kids, Mustafa and Shireen, who are refugees from Syria who live in East Amman. And for their parents, because we had the lockdown, they had to drop their schedule to make sure each of their 5 children has a turn using the family's one TV and one mobile phone to do their schoolwork. So it's a very challenging thing, obviously, for them. And in terms of discrimination, obviously this is a huge issue, and we try as much as possible to integrate people into our community. They are our neighbors. We want the best for them because the best for them is the best for us. And we want them to be a healthy society again in the future for them and for their children. And that's the only way to benefit from all of us. And I think that all around the world, everybody has to realize this. And it's no shame. I mean, the richest countries in the world are the ones who are rejecting taking in refugees. And that is a real shame. And that includes in my own region, to be honest.
Okay, thank you so much, Prince Ali. This is a question to Seme. Seme, also, could you pronounce your name so I make sure that I'm not mispronouncing it? But ICANN South Sudan, what is the role of governments and NGOs to overcome the problems of children on the move in the present scenario?
Thank you so much for that question. I can say the solution to help children in the move will also echo into to the word that was said by one of the panelists, that peace is the biggest solution we can have. But internally, we have to look into it that the government entities and NGOs, they should look into issues pertaining children who are on the move, like the most vulnerable children. There should be a budget. There should be a budget allocated especially for those children to support them. More especially the unaccompanied minors. These are children who are sometimes given to refugees who also struggle to support themselves. And we look into it that if, more especially now during in the midst of COVID-19, in a refugee settlement, more especially in Uganda, food rations are being cut down, they have been reduced. That means even the caretaker is receiving less food, and the child also is receiving less food. That means there is a difficulty of the caretaker. There's a burden already of livelihood, maintaining the livelihood of the family. So we have to look into it that if we give out an unaccompanied minor to a caretaker, we also have to look into a solution of supporting that caretaker at the same time also supporting the child, so that the harmony in between the child and the caretaker will be good. So I call upon the governments and the NGOs to look into it, that sometimes we need to look into permanent spaces where these children can stay. If they can be under the government, they should be having a space where they will get used to than changing them from one caretaker to another. So that is what I look into it, that will surely help the children on the move. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This is such an interesting panel, and it's because everybody on this panel has done such extraordinary work on people on the move, on peace, on protecting children, and devoted their lives to creating a more just and peaceful world. So I really want to thank everyone. Just sort of as a wrap up, I think, I really want to go back to something Abraham said, which is that this, after all, is an appeal to our moral conscience. And I think we need to keep that front and center. And then this is a shared responsibility. We talked about that. This is a global responsibility. It's going to require each and every one of us, but it's going to require all of the governments, our regional governments, and the entire world. As Prince Ali said, extreme poverty is a form of violence, and we don't really think of it that way, but of course it is. And it's a public health issue, just as even more vast than COVID-19. And that's something that we need to work together on in order to create change. As President Jennings said, we need peace. 1 in 10 children across the globe live in an area of war, and none of this will be changed until we really focus on peace. And then education. I think every single person here talked about education, about the importance of education, as Mariana said, for children to fulfill their potential, and as a place to heal trauma. Healthcare, we need access to physical healthcare, to mental health care, to healthcare for people with physical disabilities and diseases. Be safe and available and free to people across our globe. We need to address, as Semi said, the issues of unaccompanied minors and their vulnerabilities to being trafficked and abused in so many ways. Access to sanitation, protection from child trafficking. And then Josie talked about the importance of telling the stories. That we need to not just empathize, but we need to treat people with open hearts. And Jody, I love what you said. You said, we know what the solutions are. We know how to do this. We need to bring together the coalitions and to demand change from our governments. So I guess in my own conclusion, this is what I'd say. I think, look at this panel. This is a panel of extraordinary people and this entire conference is a conference full of extraordinary people who've made a mark on the world. But not all of us are going to make a mark on the world. But each of us has our own gifts. So it might be pulling together a coalition of people around the world to create change, or it might be that you can dance or you can sing or you can play soccer and you can get other people engaged in whatever gift you've been given to make the world more just and peaceful, especially for the most vulnerable, especially for children in the wake of COVID-19. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much to our organizers and again to Kailash Satyarthi, our leader. Thank you.
Please enjoy the following video. The final plenary of the summit will lay out the path forward. To begin, we welcome 1996 Nobel Peace Laureate, former president of Timor-Leste and convener of the Laureates and Leaders for Children, His Excellency José Ramos Horta.
This is José Ramos Horta, former president of Timor-Leste. I'm joining my many colleagues, Nobel laureates and global leaders to appeal to all of you across the globe to unite and to act now to protect the most vulnerable, the children of the world, child labor victims, child slavery victims, the most destitute of us, of our humanity, who have no access to clean water, to school, to 3 meals a day, and are the most impacted now by COVID-19. We cannot fail them. If we fail, we are accomplices, we are guilty in betraying these children. Please act together, act now.
We will now hear from the First Lady of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, Her Excellency Ruhollah Ashraf Ghani.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, to the participants of the Third Children's Summit, laureates and leaders, and to educators all over the world, I come to you in peace. Assalamu alaikum. The reason children often fall in the category of vulnerable populations is because they need to rely on us adults around them to be able to fulfill their own potential. In other words, yes, we adults are responsible for our children's fate, not only our own, but children all over the world. And the higher our position, the greater our responsibility. It is our responsibility to nurture each and every child we can reach, because each and every child has the potential for greatness and distinction. In a world in constant transformation, where conflicts and wars tear away at the very fabric of society, in a world where the sense of security, the comfort of belonging to a caring group, the certainty of a bright future are fast becoming the luxury of a few. In a world where the social compact between society and its members no longer carries any meaning, where even medical emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, can wreak havoc because of the absence of thoughtful coordination and the prevalence of political interest, it is high time that we stop and reflect. This is why this present initiative of Children's Summit, today in its third year, is so important. Neglecting our children is self-destructive. Caring for them will bring back sense to our lives and help us reevaluate our priorities. If we want our future to look better than our present, then we need to start by planting the seeds of renovation and renewal in the rising generations. Every child counts.
I now welcome the Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, His Excellency Jose Angel Gurria.
President Ramos Horta, First Lady Ruhollah Ghani, laureates, leaders, dearest friends, and dearest Kailash. It is a pleasure to address the Fair Share for Children Summit 2020. As we have heard today, the economic and social consequences of COVID-19 are expected to affect children severely. They already are. I very much share the concern that has been expressed by laureates and leaders about this grave challenge. From the outset, we at the OECD have been clear that in managing the crisis, priority must be given to protecting the lives and the well-being of the most vulnerable. And that starts with the children. Now, the pandemic is harming the health, social, and material well-being of all children worldwide, and the most vulnerable children are suffering the most. While saving lives is a priority during a pandemic, school closures, social distancing, confinement, widen inequalities between children. Such measures increase the risk of poor nutrition, exposure to violence at home, higher anxiety and stress, and reduced access to vital family and care services. The economic downturn is expected to increase child poverty, leading to a greater number of children not returning to school. These children are at real risk of being drawn into child labor. A joint report published by the ILO, the International Office of Migration, the OECD, and UNICEF in 2019, which was called Ending Child Labor, Forced Labor and Human Trafficking in the Global Supply Chain, provided the first global estimates of the extent of children working in global supply chains. The numbers are shocking, from 12% in sub-Saharan Africa to 26% in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, in Eastern and Southeastern Asia. We cannot risk seeing these numbers increase even further. The OECD has made child well-being a priority in its work. We will accelerate the pace. We recognize the higher level of investment and the better policy making required for managing the impact of this crisis on children. We call on all countries to ensure that children get their fair share of the global response to the pandemic. As we tackle the crisis together, you can count on the OECD to continue supporting countries to put children at the center of their social policy agendas. Thank you.
The next speaker is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Ms. Sharon Barrow.
Good evening. I am honored to be with you all, and there could be no greater challenge for all of us. Indeed, the legacy that the world has left for our children is a scandal. It is indeed the reality that children will bear the economic and social cost of a fractured world even before COVID-19, and now the impact on health, on income, on insecurity for years and years to come. You know, it's about decent work. It's about shared prosperity. If children's parents had decent work, then in fact children would have a future, beginning with the right to go to school. So why are our children out of school in 2020? Why are our children actually forced to work in 2020? It's because despite the historic universal ratification of the worst forms of child labour, this world, our global leaders, we ourselves have failed to unite to eliminate the scourge of child labour. We have failed to invest in universal health and social protection for all, and the most vulnerable children will suffer even worse the impact of this terrible global pandemic. But decent work, jobs for everybody, with the opportunity for children to be educated, it's within our grasp. We have to take up this challenge and leave no leader without the understanding that people are holding them to account. No corporate greed can force our children into work for more profit if, in fact, the world, our leaders, and we ourselves stand united with a new social contract demand with children and their parents at its core. We want a decent future, health, education, care, and indeed jobs and social protection for all. This will build a better and more equal and more secure world where we can genuinely see the peace that we've just listened to our leaders about. Thank you, and thank you with all our heart from all the workers around the world for all your commitment to what is indeed the scourge of our time, children absolutely forced into work, left to survive because we don't have the will to eliminate this scourge. Thank you.
We will now hear from the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union, Mr. Peter Kwasi Koji.
Excellencies, distinguished Nobel Prize laureates, global leaders, and young people watching from all over the world. Good afternoon, good evening. I wish to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to say a few words at the Laureates and Leaders for Children Summit. I want to particularly thank Dr. Kailash Satyarthi for his vision to bring together renowned world leaders to show the way to globalize compassion for marginalized children. In May, during the peak of the pandemic, the leaders and laureates convened a crisis meeting, which I had the privilege to address, and I saw firsthand how committed they are to building a world where every child is free, safe, and educated. Yesterday and today, we've listened in horror to the shocking experiences of our marginalized brothers and sisters during this pandemic. But the world seems to have moved on, and now we're asking them to accept this new reality as the new normal. But for the many children living in slums with no option to isolate, that cannot be the new normal. For the many children who go to bed hungry because of school closures, that certainly cannot be the new normal. For the many young children, especially girls who will potentially not return to the classroom when schools reopen, that certainly cannot be referred to as the new normal. I'm constrained for time to provide an exhaustive list of all the injustices we've come to take for granted. Accepting any of this as normal is a failure of humanity. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been fighting extremely hard to get world leaders to take action so that the over 200 million children out of school can get access to education. But this pandemic threatens to erode all the gains we have made. Ahead of the UN General Assembly next week, young children, young people, mindful that it is us who will inherit all the debts being deployed in the form of stimulus packages to companies, believe strongly that we should have a say how these monies are being used. Young people of the world are asking for a fair share of these monies to be allocated to the most marginalized children to avoid a glaring disaster. Since April, supported by the leaders and laureates, we have been rigorously campaigning to world leaders all over the world to commit a fair share of the government funds allocated to the coronavirus recovery to support the needs of the 20% most marginalized and excluded children and their families. And this is where we need everyone, from the leaders and laureates on these panels, all global citizens, young people, students who are watching, to join us to press home these demands. For we know too well that when we stand together, our collective influence and power will reinforce our actions to achieve a much greater impact. On behalf of myself and my colleagues, I'm asking every young person from all over the world to join us to demand justice for every child. For we know that while posterity judges the people who perpetuate evil, an even more sterner reckoning is for the complicit, the people who look on and do nothing. Thank you very much.
I am pleased to welcome Columbia University professor and director of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be together with you and also to add my voice to the much bigger voices calling for social justice and help for our children. We are in the midst of the worst global crisis, certainly since World War II, and the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. We're also in the midst of a massive political crisis where presidents do not know how to tell the truth, and 190,000 deaths later, we learn of yet again of the abuses by political leaders who don't care and who are dishonest and who are not transparent. This is our challenge right now. the humanitarian crisis is deepening dramatically, and we don't even know the extent of it because events are moving faster by far than our data can keep up. We know that hunger is rising, destitution is rising, and desperation is rising. In the very short term, my own recommendation is that we turn to the multilateral institutions, especially the International Monetary Fund, which has done an excellent job of providing emergency financing assistance, but call on the IMF, the World Bank, and the other international financial institutions to provide far more resources without the normal conditionalities so that we avoid a hunger crisis, we avoid massive rise of deaths because of diversion of health and medical personnel, we avoid the misery and suffering of increased destitution right now. The IMF has emergency financing facilities that have provided more than $80 billion since the start of the crisis, but we need vastly more than that. The rich countries are spending trillions of dollars extra right now. The poor countries, of course, don't have the resources by themselves to do this. This is the most essential short-term step that we can endeavor. Every finance minister of a poor country should know when you need help for food aid, for urgent social protection, for medical equipment, it's not your budget that's going to limit things. It is your possibility, and we need to make that a reality, and it is not a reality at this moment. Beyond that, we're going to need a massive global cooperative recovery program. We're going to have to cancel debts of low-income countries, not just postpone debt repayments. We are going to have to build the new world based on the Sustainable Development Goals, as we promised to do before COVID-19, but we're falling short even then. This is the time for us, therefore, to absolutely together, and thank you, Kailash, for bringing us together, raise our voices about the urgency of the moment, the urgency of the humanitarian crises, but then be determined to be relentless to ensure that children are getting back to school, that healthcare is available for all, that we are facing the future like we promised to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. The world is rich beyond imagining. 4 Americans, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and Jeffrey Bezos, 4 Americans have $500 billion of wealth. So why are children dying, suffering of undernourishment, not having access to the most basic needs? There's no reason. Let us be clear, determined, and relentless, and we follow you, Kailash, in that way, because that is absolutely your trademark. Thank you for letting me share a few thoughts. Let's raise our voice to ensure the resources are there for all the world's children. Thank you very much.
Our final speaker is the man who brought us all together for this summit. 2014 Nobel Peace Laureate, Mr. Kailash Satyarthi.
My dear children, Your Excellencies, fellow Nobel laureates, and distinguished sisters and brothers. On behalf of laureates and leaders for children and the children of the world, I express my deepest gratitude for lending your voice for the most marginalized children as well as their families. But at this juncture, I would also like to salute all the young leaders who participated and spoke at the summit. It gives me a confidence that the world is in safe hands. your purity, your energy, and your vision, your leadership is definitely the ray of hope in these difficult times and in the future. My dear children of the world, I am here to tell you, we are here to tell you, that we have not assembled here to debate and discuss on the problem or even on the solutions. We are here to tell you one thing. We are not going to fail you. We are not going to leave you. We will brave the storms, but rest assured that we are not going to leave you in the storm. We stand by you and we will fight for you. We are here to tell to the global citizens that we are not going to tolerate the business as usual in dealing with the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 crisis. We are not going to accept that the agonies, the miseries, the child labor, slavery, trafficking becomes the new normal. We are determined that the fair share for children should become or must become the new normal. That is going to become a mass movement, and I assure you that they are going to become the new culture in all spheres of life. Fair share for children. I would also like to urge to the governments on behalf of the laureates and leaders that this is the right time to show your leadership. Be bold. Act with compassion. Act with a sense of urgency. Act united. And there is nothing more powerful way of uniting the world than the compassion for children. And that's why we reiterate those demands which were raised by us as well as echoed by all the speakers. The first of all, that 20% of the COVID-19 pandemic response fund must be allotted for the most marginalized 20% children and their families of the world. It is possible. It is justifiable. We know that $8 trillion, over $8 trillion have been allocated. And all the speakers have echoed that only 0.13% is going for the most needy people of the world through the multilateral appeals. This is unacceptable. Our second demand is that many children will be dropped out of their schools and they may become child laborers, child slaves. So the governments have to take urgent policy actions, funding, and the compliances to ensure that the children should not be trapped into slavery, trafficking, child labor, and other kind of miserable situations, which is imminent to happen if we don't act now. They have to act also on other aspects like the growing online child sexual abuse, dropping out from schools. Ensure that no child is left behind once the pandemic is over. Children come back to schools. And that requires strong, bold leadership. Thirdly, we also demand, and we know that the poorest people, the most marginalized and vulnerable communities and sections of society are facing this crisis and paying the price for it losing their traditional livelihoods, even the day-to-day life is being affected. And that's why the social protection for marginalized people is must. Governments have to make sure that there is a social safety net for those vulnerable communities, marginalized communities across the globe. And fourthly, once the vaccine is available, it should be made available free for everyone universally. This is the least we can do to create a sense of solidarity and a sense of equality and justice. And finally, I would call upon the young people. Don't wait for your leaders. Don't look at the champions outside. There is a champion inside each one in you. I know that in last 2 days, hundreds of thousands of young people through 100 million campaign and through other sources are joining this summit. So you are not simply listeners, dear friends. You are leaders. You are champions. Take rein in your hands. Take the leadership in your hands and act and raise your voice to build Fair Share campaign. Fair Share for Children campaign should be led by young people across the world. Finally, I would call upon everyone. We cannot afford to lose the entire generation. We are wealthier and more resourceful than any given point of time in the history. So protection of our children, education for our children, healthcare and saving them from hunger is not only possible and affordable, it is very much achievable. And that's why we have to act now. On behalf of all the leaders and laureates who joined these events, while thanking you, we call upon you to march. March from exploitation to education. Let us march from slavery to liberty. Let us march from poverty and hunger and miseries and vulnerabilities to sheer prosperity. Let us march from darkness to light. Let us march together from violence to peace. There is no other choice left in these times. We have to march. We have to march. Let us march, dear friends. Thank you so much.
This concludes the biannual Laureates and Leaders for Children Summit. Thank you to the organizers, all the laureates and leaders, and especially to each of you for joining us this past 2 days. All of the videos for each session from today and yesterday are or will soon be available on Facebook and YouTube. This summit was only the beginning. Each of you who registered for this event will soon receive our report detailing all the issues we discussed and outlining the demands we are collectively making of the world's governments to ensure every child, but most importantly the most marginalized, have their fair share of the COVID-19 funding. We encourage you to use that report as a tool so that between now and the UN General Assembly, which meets later this month, we can collectively amplify this message and demand to governments around the world that they must not fail the world's children. On behalf of the world's children, I thank you.
Once again, we raise our voices in celebration. together.